The bucket hit her square across the shoulders, and 400 people laughed. Ice water ran down Grace Toussaint's collar, soaked through her gray long sleeve, and pooled on the blue mat under the arena lights, while Kurt Vanderhook held the empty bucket over his head like a trophy. "Look at her, folks," he shouted into the microphone. "The little gutter mouse is shaking." Two of his students held her arms pinned behind her back. Kurt reached out, snatched the wool toque off her head, dropped it on the mat, and ground it under his heel. Once, twice, 3 times. "You people come into my building," he said, leaning in close enough that the mic caught every word, "and you think you belong here. You're too soft for a real fight, sweetheart. Too soft." He turned to the crowd and spread his arms, and the crowd roared, and phones came up in every row like a field of little glowing flowers. Grace said nothing. She stood dripping under the lights in her torn dignity and her thin, black gloves, and she looked at a point on the far wall, and she breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. But Kurt Vanderhook did not know one thing. He did not know what those gloves were covering, and what came out from under the sleeves of that quiet woman in front of 400 witnesses and a live camera would follow him for the rest of his life. Birchport, Ontario. A harbour town on Georgian Bay, 2 hours north of Toronto if the 400 behaves, 3 if it doesn't. The kind of place with 1 main street, 2 rinks, and a Legion Hall that still does fish fry Fridays. Everybody knows everybody in Birchport, which is exactly why nobody really knew Grace Toussaint at all. She lived in the 1-bedroom above Halloran's Bakery on Dominion Street, 36 years old. Paid her rent by e-transfer on the 1st of the month, never a day late, never a dollar short. She'd moved up from Nova Scotia 6 years back. Grew up in North Preston, outside Halifax, one of the oldest black communities in the country, raised by a grandmother who cleaned offices at night and never once complained where the kids could hear. Grace was polite to her neighbors. She shoveled the walk in front of the bakery before old Mr. Halloran could get to it. She waved. She did not linger. 5 days a week she worked the service desk at Royal Canadian Legion Branch 112, helping veterans wrestle their disability claims through Veterans Affairs. Hearing loss files, knee files. The other kind of files, the ones nobody puts a body part on. Her co-workers knew she'd served. Her file said so. They didn't know much else, because Grace didn't offer, and something in the way she didn't offer made people stop asking. She wore long sleeves 12 months of the year. She wore thin black gloves, even indoors. Even in July, when the fans in the Legion Hall just pushed the hot air around, the bartender asked her about it once. Friendly. No harm meant. Grace smiled and said her circulation was bad. That was the whole conversation. That was always the whole conversation. Here is what nobody in Birchport knew. 8 years earlier, Grace Toussaint had been Sergeant Toussaint of the Canadian Armed Forces, a close-quarters combatives instructor at CFB Gagetown, one of the youngest women ever to run that program. Before the Army, she'd been a junior national judo medalist out of Dartmouth. In uniform, she'd won the Military Combatives Championship 3 times, 2013, 2015, 2017, and taken gold at the International Military Games in Rio against fighters from 30 countries. In that small, hard world of people who fight for a living, she had a nickname. They called her the Anchor, partly because once she got her grips on you, you went where she decided you went, and partly because of Molly. November 2018, Operation Presence. A Chinook helicopter went down hard on the airstrip outside Gao and caught fire with 3 crew still inside. Sergeant Toussaint was 40 meters away when it hit. She went in 3 times. The 3rd time, the fuel line let go. She came out with the flight engineer over her shoulder, and her sleeves burned off her arms, and she did not stop walking until the medic made her sit down. The burns ran from her wrists to her elbows on both arms, worse on the left, where the nerve damage took most of her grip. On a good day now, the left hand closed at maybe 80%. On a cold day, less. They gave her the Medal of Military Valor for it. There was a ceremony in Ottawa. There was a photograph in the Legion magazine. A young black sergeant with bandaged forearms and a medal on her chest and an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. Anyone who had been through the combatives world, anyone who had ever trained under her or watched the Rio final, would know those scars on sight, which is exactly why she covered them. She was medically released in 2020. The medal went into an old tea tin on top of the fridge, and the tea tin did not come down. Grace Toussaint did not want to be recognized. She did not want to be thanked for her service. She wanted to help old soldiers fill out forms, drink her coffee, and be left alone. Now meet Kurt Vanderhoek, 41 years old, owner of Vanderhoek Combat Academy, the big corrugated steel building down on the harbor front, with his own face painted 2 stories tall on the side. 3rd-degree black belt, former junior hockey enforcer, 3 seasons in the OHL, 200 penalty minutes a year, never sniffed the NHL. After hockey came MMA, 11 professional fights on the regional circuit, 8 wins, and a highlight reel he replayed on Instagram like a hymn. 60,000 followers, a podcast, a line of supplements with his jawline on the tub, and a problem. A big box martial arts franchise had opened in Barrie the year before, $20 a month, childcare included, and Vanderhoek Combat Academy was bleeding members. Enrollment down 1/3. The lease on the harborfront building came up for renewal in the spring, and the landlord was making noises about a brewery that wanted the space. Kurt needed a moment. Something loud, something that would travel, so he invented the Birchport Open Challenge. $5,000 cash to any civilian off the street who could last 3 minutes in the ring with one of his fighters. 400 tickets at $25 a seat sold out in 6 days, a regional news crew confirmed. The whole event streaming live on the Academy's channel. The morning of the show, Kurt stood in front of his bathroom mirror in his custom black gi with the gold trim and practiced his smile, the one that photographed like confidence and worked like a blade. He had no idea that the quiet woman about to buy a coffee 4 blocks away was going to end everything he'd built by supper time. Grace hadn't even wanted to go. Her neighbor Sherry McPhee had pressed the ticket on her over the fence. Sherry's boy, Tyson, 17, was fighting in the amateur opener, and Sherry had 2 comps and no husband anymore and didn't want to sit alone. Grace liked Sherry. Sherry brought her butter tarts at Christmas and never asked about the gloves. So Grace said yes, the way you say yes in a small town, because saying no costs more. She stopped at the Tim's on Huron Street for a double-double, and at 12:40 she handed her ticket to the usher and found her seat. Row 19, far corner, last chair before the exit doors. Her kind of seat. She kept her coat on her lap and her toque on her head, and she planned the afternoon the way she planned everything. Watch Tyson's fight, clap loud, slip out before the main card. That was the plan. At 1 o'clock the lights dropped, the smoke machines coughed, and the bass came up through the bleachers like a second heartbeat. Kurt Vanderhoek burst through the curtain to a wall of noise. He worked the room like a man who had rehearsed it because he had. Jokes about the Leafs. Jokes about the franchise gym in Barrie and the soy lattes they probably served. He called himself the last real fighter north of the 400, and 400 people cheered, and the live stream counter climbed past 2,000. Then he announced the warm-up demo. Before the challenge matches, he said he wanted a volunteer from the crowd. Somebody ordinary. Somebody who'd never trained a day. He wanted to show the good people of Birchport what real combat felt like up close. His eyes went along the rows, past the front row regulars with their phones already up, past the hockey dads, past Sherry McPhee, who was digging in her purse for gum. They stopped on the woman in row 19. The one black woman in the section sitting alone, gloves in July. No, October, but gloves indoors, toque pulled low, coffee in hand. Different, alone, perfect. Kurt smiled and pointed the microphone at her like a rifle. You, gray jacket, come on down. Grace shook her head once. Calm. Small, a few people laughed. Kurt's smile got wider, and he snapped his fingers, and 2 of his senior students stood up from the front row, Cody Renner and Mitch Dubois, both 6'2" and change, both former university wrestlers, both very used to doing what Coach said. They came up the aisle 2 steps at a time. Grace set her coffee on the empty seat beside her, slowly, carefully. In the 2 seconds that took, she ran the arithmetic she had been trained to run, and the arithmetic came back ugly. There was no version of the next 10 minutes where she walked out of this building the same person who had walked in. She could feel it settle over her like weather. Cody took her left arm. Mitch took her right. Come on, sweetheart, one of them said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. Coach just wants to say hi. She didn't fight them. Understand that. She let them walk her down the aisle with 400 faces tracking her and every phone in the building coming up, and she kept her arms loose and her breathing even. 4 counts in, 4 counts out, the way Gagetown had drilled into her until it was less a technique than a religion. Up the 4 steps, onto the raised mat, into the lights. Kurt circled her once, looking her up and down the way a man looks at a used snowblower. What's your name, on? Speak up for the folks. Nothing. Aw, she's shy. Big hand for her, everybody. She's nervous. The crowd clapped on command. Kurt let the smile fall off his face like he was setting down a prop. I asked your name. I don't want to be here. Her voice was level, flat, almost bored. On the live stream, later, people would slow that clip down and study it, because there was something underneath the flatness, and once you knew the ending, you could hear it plain as a train. Kurt laughed into the mic. She doesn't want to be here, folks. Too bad, eh? You bought a ticket. You're part of the show. He started to circle again. Where you from? Not Birchport, I'd remember. You staying at the shelter on Dominion? You one of Ontario Work's finest? The room laughed. Not all of it, but enough of it. That's what's wrong with this country, he said, warming up now, finding the rhythm he used on the podcast. No standards. Anybody just walks in anywhere. He leaned close, and the microphone caught it all. Gloves and a toque indoors, sweetheart. What are we hiding? Track marks? Or did the food bank run out of soap this week? Real laughter now, ugly and rolling. A man in row 4 stopped laughing and looked at his shoes. A woman in row 11 said quietly, "Come on, that's enough." But only the people beside her heard it, and nobody stood up. Nobody ever stands up. That is the part of this story you should sit with. Kurt grabbed her right glove and yanked. Grace pulled her hand back, calm, firm, final. The glove stayed on, and something went dark behind Kurt Vanderhook's eyes, because nobody pulled away from him on his own mat, in his own building, under his own 2-story face. He snapped his fingers twice. Cody and Mitch moved in and pinned her arms back behind her shoulders. Not hard enough to injure, hard enough to hold. That was when he did the bucket. That was when he did the toque, and the heel, 1, 2, 3, and the line about being too soft for a real fight, and the crowd roared. And we are back where this story began, with ice water running down the collar of a woman standing perfectly still. Inside that stillness, Grace was counting. 3 seconds. That was the doctrine she'd taught for years at Gagetown. Before any escalation in close quarters, you take 3 full seconds, if the situation gives them to you, and you choose a course of action you can live with afterward. Not the one that feels good, the one you can live with. She had made 19-year-old privates recite it back to her in the rain. 1, 2, 3. She chose. She stayed still, and it would have ended there. It truly would have. She had already decided to stand there and absorb the whole circus and go home to her apartment and her kettle, except that Kurt made his last mistake. He waved the boys off, told the crowd he'd now demonstrate a compliance escort on our lovely volunteer, and grabbed her left wrist, the bad one, the one that was mostly scar tissue and rebuilt nerve, and he cranked it into a lock, hard, showing off for the cameras, and pain went up Grace's arm like electrical fire. She said clearly, loud enough for the mic, "Let go of my wrist, please." Kurt grinned at the crowd and cranked harder. What happened next took 1.8 seconds. They measured it later, frame by frame, in a courtroom in Barrie. Her left hand rotated against his thumb, the one direction every wrist lock is weak, and was simply gone from his grip. Her right hand took his sleeve at the elbow. Her hip found his hip. His 220 pounds went up over her like water going over a stone, and the mat boomed. And before the sound finished, bouncing off the steel roof, she had rolled him to his stomach, caught his right wrist, and locked it into a textbook straight armbar. Knee settled on his shoulder blade, joint taken to the exact edge of its range and held there. 1 more ounce of pressure and something breaks. She did not add the ounce. Silence. 400 people, and not one sound. The bass had cut out between songs, and the room was so quiet you could hear a paper cup roll off a bleacher up in row 12 and tick its way down, step by step, all the way to the floor. Kurt's cheek was pressed into his own mat. "Get off me," he whispered. Grace spoke for the second time on that stage, and her voice was almost gentle. "Tap the mat. Twice. Slow." He didn't. She breathed a fraction more weight through her knee. A fraction. And he tapped, twice, slow, and she released him instantly. Stood, stepped back 2 full paces, and let her hands fall open at her sides. Open hands. Every instructor's habit. Nothing hidden. Nothing coming. That was when the room saw her arm. Her left sleeve had torn away at the seam during the throw, shoulder to wrist, and the glove had come half off, and under the harsh white stage light the burn scars were plain, rippled, pale, running the whole forearm like a river seen from a plane, down over a hand that did not sit quite the way hands sit. On the live stream, the chat went so fast it blurred. In the building, for 2 more seconds, nobody moved. Then a man in row 5 stood up. He was 71 years old, in a Legion blazer with a poppy pinned to it even though it was only October, and his name was Hamish Coyle. Chief Warrant Officer, retired, 34 years in uniform, the last 6 of them running the combatives program that a young sergeant from North Preston had once torn through like a rumor. He had been in Gao in 2018. He had stood in a hospital corridor in Germany while they debrided her arms because somebody senior should be there and nobody else had come yet. He had read her citation aloud at the ceremony because she had asked, quietly, not to have to speak. His voice cracked, but it carried to the roof. My God. That's Toussaint. That's the anchor. 400 heads turned. Coyle didn't care. He was looking at the scars, and his eyes were streaming. And he said it again for the back rows. Sergeant Grace Toussaint. Medal of Military Valor. I was there. I was there. A woman stood up in row 14. Mid-40s, ball cap, a flight jacket gone soft at the elbows. Tamsin Lowe, former sergeant, formerly a flight engineer on a Chinook that went down burning outside Gao. She did not shout. She barely got the words out at all, but the room was that quiet so everybody heard them. That's her. She's the one who pulled me out. Then a man near the back, in a Legion Branch 112 golf shirt. A Bosnia veteran whose paperwork Grace had untangled last spring without ever mentioning her own. Then 2 more. Then an old woman gripping a cane, widow of a Korea vet, on her feet with everyone else. 11 veterans standing in a martial arts gym in Birchport, Ontario, and not one of them saying a word because there was nothing to add. Grace looked at Hamish Coyle for a long moment. Then she did the thing nobody expected, the thing the internet would watch 12 million times. She came slowly to attention, and she raised her ruined left hand to her brow, and she held the salute for 3 full seconds. Coyle returned it. Tamsin Lowe returned it. Every standing veteran in that building returned it, and the regional news camera got all of it, clean, in one unbroken shot. Kurt Vanderhoek pushed himself up onto his elbows, and he saw the salute, and he saw the scars, and the color went out of his face like someone had pulled a plug, because he had seen those scars before. In a magazine at his own black belt grading, years ago, in a grainy video of a final in Rio that his own instructor had made the class watch. The anchor, he'd laughed along with everyone else at how the announcer said it. Pride is a kind of drunkenness. He got up and charged her. Grace stepped off the line at the last half second, took his arm, gave his momentum back to him with interest, and the mat boomed again. He got up. He charged. A 3rd time. Same. The 4th time he went down, he stayed there, nose bleeding from his own impact, shoulder screaming from his own bad landing, and Grace Toussaint had still not thrown a single strike. She had not so much as closed her fists. The use of force people have a phrase for what the footage showed, and you will hear it again in a courtroom before this story is done. Minimum necessary force. Textbook. All of it. She looked down at him for exactly 1 second, with no expression at all. Then she crossed the mat, bent down, picked up her toque, brushed it off, and put it back on her head. She walked down the 4 steps and up the center aisle, and 400 people parted like water. And nobody was laughing now, and half the phones had been lowered because some things you suddenly don't feel entitled to film. She pushed open the doors and walked out into the gray October afternoon, and she did not look back. Behind her, Hamish Coyle was still standing, still saluting. By Sunday night, Grace Toussaint was the most talked about woman in Birchport. By Wednesday, she was the most hated. Hold on to that sentence, because how it happened is the whole second half of this story. Kurt Vanderhoek did not spend the weekend icing his shoulder. He spent it on the phone. A crisis PR firm out of Toronto, 2 lawyers, and a freelance editor who advertised narrative reconstruction services, which is a beautiful phrase for a filthy job. The Academy's official live stream, all 41 minutes of it, quietly vanished from the channel. In its place by Monday morning, a 22-second clip was moving through every hockey parent group chat and community Facebook page in the county. It opened with Grace already mid-throw, Kurt's body hitting the mat, the armbar, his face down, in obvious pain, a woman kneeling on his back. No bucket, no toque, no students pinning her arms, no wrist lock, no please. The caption wrote itself. Local coach attacked at charity event by unstable ex-military spectator. The lawsuit landed Thursday. $1.2 million. Assault, battery, loss of income, reputational harm. And the town. The town did what towns do when they only have 22 seconds of the truth. Someone spray-painted the word P.I. Seiko on the bakery door below her apartment. Mr. Halloran was out there at 6 a.m. with a bucket and a brush, and he wouldn't let her help, and he wouldn't talk about it. The Legion's provincial liaison got nervous phone calls, and the branch board, over the objection of nearly everyone who actually knew her, suspended Grace from the service desk pending review. She was escorted out past the fish fry posters by a man whose pension claim she had personally rescued 11 months earlier. He couldn't look at her. She made it easy for him and looked at the floor instead. Grace went home, put the kettle on, and sat at her kitchen table with her hands flat in front of her. And for the first time since Gao, she caught herself thinking that the fire had been simpler. Then, on the 9th day, 2 things happened. The first knock on her door was a lawyer, Farah Bassi, up from Toronto, sharp gray suit, no small talk. She'd done 8 years as a Crown prosecutor before going private, and she was there pro bono. When Grace asked why, Bassi said an old warrant officer had phoned her father, and her father had phoned her, and in her family when a 34-year soldier calls in the middle of the night and says a decorated veteran is being buried by a rich man's edit, you drive north. That was the whole explanation. It was enough. The second thing was a 17-year-old boy named Tyson McPhee, standing on the stairs behind the lawyer, holding his phone like it was made of glass. Tyson was a fan. Tyson archived every Vanderhook Academy stream the way other kids archive game film. He had the original 41 minutes, untouched, time-stamped, downloaded an hour after the event, and long before it disappeared. "Ma'am," he said to Grace, and his voice shook, "my mum's the one who gave you the ticket. This is our fault. Tell me where to send it." The civil trial opened on a Tuesday in February at the courthouse in Barrie, Justice Corinne Ellsworth presiding, and Kurt's lead counsel went first. He was polished. He was expensive. He played the 22 seconds twice, talked about an unprovoked attack on a beloved community figure, and asked for the full $1.2 million. He sat down at 10:15. Farah Bassi stood up at 10:16. She did not raise her voice once all day. She walked to the screen, opened her laptop, and said, "Your Honor, the plaintiff has shown this court 22 seconds. With the court's patience, the defense will show the other 41 minutes. She pressed play. The courtroom watched Kurt point into the crowd. They watched 2 large men pull a seated woman from row 19. They watched the shelter line, the Ontario Works line, the soap line. They watched the glove grab, the finger snap, the pinned arms, the bucket, the toke under the heel, and they heard in crisp livestream audio a flat, quiet voice say, "I don't want to be here." And later, "Let go of my wrist, please." They watched the wrist crank. Then they watched 1.8 seconds. Then they watched 11 veterans rise one by one out of a silent crowd, and an old man's salute, and Justice Ellsworth, who had seen 30 years of video evidence, sat very still. Bassi called Chief Warrant Officer, Reed Hamish Coyle. He testified for 40 minutes. He explained the Canadian Force's use of force continuum, the way he'd explained it to 2 generations of soldiers. He walked the court through the footage frame by frame. Asked for his professional assessment, he looked directly at the plaintiff's table and said, "Everything she did was textbook minimum force. There were 3 trained men within reach of her, and she chose to injure none of them. In 34 years of service, I have never seen restraint like it, and I trained her, so I am allowed to say that." "And the scars, Chief Warrant Officer, do you recognize them?" Coyle's jaw worked for a moment before the words came. "I do," he said. "I stood in the burn unit in Germany while they were treated. November 2018. She went into a burning aircraft 3 times. The 3rd time, nobody would have blamed her for staying out. Those are the hands that carried my flight engineer out of the fire, and I would ask the plaintiff's counsel to be very careful what he calls them. No cross-examination." Bassi called Tamsin Lowe, who described being unconscious in a burning Chinook and waking up on gravel with someone else's blood and someone else's skin on her flight suit. She was asked whether the person who pulled her out received a decoration. "Yes," Lowe said, "the Medal of Military Valor. It's the one she isn't wearing today, because she keeps it in a tea tin, because that's who she is." Somebody in the gallery exhaled like they'd been holding it since morning. A juror wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Then Bassi did the thing that ended it. She put a single image on the screen. The old Legion magazine photograph, the young sergeant with the bandaged arms and the medal. And she turned to the plaintiff. "Mr. Vanderhook, you told 400 people that this woman was too soft for a real fight. Define a real fight for the court, please." Silence. "Your own record then, your deployments, your service. Where did you serve, Mr. Vanderhook? His counsel objected. Relevance. Justice Ellsworth looked over her glasses and said the plaintiff had put the word combat into evidence himself, on camera, through a microphone, and he would answer. And Kurt Vanderhook, two-story face on the harbor front, last real fighter north of the 400, looked at his hands and said, I never served. Bassi let it sit for 10 full seconds. 10 seconds is a very long time in a courtroom. Then, no further questions. Justice Ellsworth offered the plaintiff a final chance to address the bench before ruling. And here is where 6 weeks of curdled pride finished him, because Kurt stood up and it all came out at once. The quota hires, the charity cases, the she didn't earn that medal, the people like her. And the gallery gasped, and his own lead counsel closed his eyes like a man listening to his retainer burn. Grace was offered the last word. Bassi looked at her. Grace nodded once, stood, and faced the man who had sued her. 17 words in that same flat, level voice. My hands were burned open, saving 3 people. I will not apologize for using them to save myself. She sat back down. Behind her, Hamish Coyle stood up, then Tamsin Lowe, then row by row, every veteran in the gallery on their feet in absolute silence, and Justice Ellsworth did not gavel them down. The ruling took under a minute. Claim dismissed in its entirety, with full costs against the plaintiff. And given the disappearance of the original footage, and the circulation of what the court called a deliberately misleading edit, the matter was referred to the Crown. Within a month, Kurt Vanderhook was charged with assault and public mischief. Cody Renner and Mitch Dubois, the 2 who had held her arms, were charged as well. The fall came fast, the way it always does when a whole town has been holding its breath. His insurer dropped the academy in 48 hours. The landlord terminated the lease for cause and signed with the brewery. The supplement company scrubbed his jawline from the tubs. The PR firm that had taken $40,000 of his money stopped returning his calls, which, when you think about it, is the most honest thing a PR firm has ever done. He pleaded guilty in the fall and served 8 months. He lives in Alberta now. He works the counter at an equipment rental place. He does not teach anymore. He will never teach again. And the boy with the tattooed knuckles, Mitch, the younger one, the one who'd said, "Come on, sweetheart," not unkindly, wrote Grace a letter from the halfway point of his conditional sentence. 4 pages, handwritten, no excuses in it, which is rarer than you'd think. He asked if there was any way on earth to make it right. Grace wrote back 3 sentences. She told him there was. She told him where to be on Tuesday night. She told him to bring nothing but running shoes and the ability to listen, because by then, Tuesday nights at Legion Branch 112 belonged to something new. Grace got her job back. The Provincial Review collapsed the day the verdict landed, and the new branch president drove to Dominion Street personally with a written apology and, because this is Canada, a box of butter tarts. Grace accepted on one condition: 4 days a week at the service desk. Tuesdays were hers. Tuesdays were open hand. Free self-defense every week in the Legion Hall with the fish fry posters and the donated mats. No tuition, ever. Someone from a magazine asked her once, in writing, why she wouldn't charge, and she answered once, in writing, "You cannot put a price on the word no, so I don't." She taught grandmothers and teenagers and new Canadians and, eventually, one former wrestling star working off a sentence, who has now been coming for over a year and has not missed a single Tuesday. She taught breathing. She taught how to stand. Mostly she taught the word no, said out loud, level, without apology. And the first time Pearl Whidden, 72 years old, 40 years a wife to a man nobody missed, said that word in front of the class without her voice shaking, Grace Toussaint smiled. 2 full seconds. The people who were there still talk about it. In the spring, Birchport Town Council passed a bylaw requiring written consent before any commercial combat demonstration could physically involve an audience member. It passed unanimously. The clerk's office called it File 2026-114. Everyone else called it the Toussaint Rule, and within a year 4 other Ontario towns had copied it word for word. The footage, the real footage, all 41 minutes, the version a 17-year-old refused to let disappear, has been viewed more than 12 million times now. The phrase Kurt used as a weapon got taken from him too. Too soft for a real fight belongs to other people now, to every woman, every veteran, every quiet person who ever got dragged onto somebody else's stage. Grace never gave a single interview, not one. The only statement she ever made hangs on the wall of the Tuesday class, hand-lettered on a piece of card. These hands stay open. She wore short sleeves to class the day she hung it. 50 students looked at the scars in the morning light, and not one of them looked away, because by then every one of them knew exactly what they meant. Hamish Coyle passed that next winter, quietly, at 72, Poppy still pinned to the blazer in his front closet. Grace gave the eulogy. It was 4 sentences long. She said he had saved more people in retirement than most officers save in a career. She said he had saved her twice, once in a hospital corridor in Germany, and once with a midnight phone call she never knew he made. So here is the thing worth carrying out of Birchport: the loud ones. The ones who mock, who grab, who need a crowd to feel tall. They are not the strong ones. They have never been the strong ones. Strength is the person with nothing left to prove. It's the one who takes 3 full seconds and chooses what she can live with. It's 11 people standing up in silence because standing was all that needed saying. And the truly strong ones are almost always the quietest person in the room, right up until the moment somebody forces their hand. So this week, pay attention to the quiet ones around you. The gloves, the long sleeves, the ones who sit near the exit. You have no idea what they've carried or who they carried it for. And be honest with yourself about one thing. If you had been in that gym in Birchport, row 11, watching a stranger get soaked and mocked while everyone laughed, would you have stood up? Put your answer in the comments. If someone in your life is one of the quiet, strong ones, put their name down there too. They've earned it. And if this story stayed with you, hit like and subscribe, because there are more true-to-life stories like this one every week here on Rune Stories. See you next time.